Thank you for joining us on this second day. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Hitesh Hathi. I'm the Executive Director at the Mittal Institute. It's really an honor and a pleasure for us to be hosting this extraordinary gathering with, I should say, hello Ian, extraordinary senior scholars who have also helped train two generations of scholars. Ian, I hope you don't mind me saying that, but Ian and I were at dinner the other day, and two of the presenters that at the talk we had been to had both been trained by Ian. So I just want to say just a little echo from yesterday, which is what makes this gathering extraordinary is one, that we have this combination of well-established scholars who've broken new ground in the field and younger scholars. And it's not often that the two groups get to engage together in this way. So I'm very happy that we were able to accommodate and make an event with the two groups together. And as I said yesterday, we're here talking about Pakistan at 75 in the face of skeptics. For those of us who never had any doubt about the resiliency of Pakistani society, it's a vindication. But for all of us, it is kind of a lesson in what Sufis would call ajaib, of wondrousness of life. You, as human beings, we think we know what's going to happen, we can predict it, but in fact, life takes its own extraordinary turns. And the thing that I learned in this conference yesterday is that we have this extraordinary collection of scholars who help us make sense of the ajaib. So I want to say, without any further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to Yaqoob Bangash. Yaqoob is a visiting Fulbright scholar at the Mittal Institute this year, and he has really been the mastermind for this conference. Yaqoob.
Thank you, Hitesh. And as you were mentioning, the generations of scholars Ian has trained, I'm one of them. So he was my PhD examiner. But it's therefore it's double pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Talbot today. If I give his full introduction, as Hitesh was again saying about some people, yesterday it'll take about half an hour. So I shall try not to. But I should also mention right at the beginning that we also have another connection, that my supervisor was also his. So there, now we can see how incestuous at least the history side of South Asia is. But Professor Ian Talbot has worked at several universities, at Coventry, at Southampton, has been at Oxford, and now is a visiting fellow here at the Mittal Institute. He was a pioneer in the study of the Punjab, and especially sort of the time surrounding the partition of the Punjab. His work on Khizr Tivana still is, even after I think 30 years now, still is the key text on it, and is the most well-researched and the most formative. And if you don't know much about Khizr Tivana and the Unionist Party of the Punjab, I'd encourage you to read about that, because that was the only party that had Hindu, Muslims, and Sikhs, and did really well, won the elections in the Punjab and stayed on in power. So that is an alternative history to an extent of it. Ian has also done with Gurapal Singh and several others a lot of work on the partition. Another very interesting book is about Lahore and Amritsar, like a comparison of it, and I think that's a very, very essential book. Then just about a decade ago, Ian did a general history of Pakistan, which is now read by anyone doing the history of Pakistan in Pakistan. But as Ian was saying, the royalty isn't reflecting any of this. I have asked actually OUP about it to actually send me numbers, because the last I checked, it had sold over 40,000 copies. So I'm not quite sure where that is going now.
The royalties haven't come my way.
Yeah, exactly.
Do it for the glory.
Yeah, exactly. But after working a lot on the partition and the Punjab, and of course generally South Asian history, he also has a book that kind of is a general survey on South Asian history. Now Ian is focusing very much on environmental history of the subcontinent, and in fact has just published an edited volume on the subject. So the talk that he's going to give today is related to that. And his next project is a lot more interesting, which is of course related to Boston and working on Jackie Kennedy's visit to Pakistan and the Queen's visit to Pakistan, and that's also quite fascinating. So you could talk to him about that during tea, perhaps.
Yes, sir.
But at the moment, I'd like Ian to present his paper on the environment, which is, of course, the most critical question in Pakistan today. So thank you so much, Ian, for being here, for agreeing to give this plenary, and we're really glad to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yaqoob, for that introduction. Whilst we're into nostalgia, I'll just say one thing briefly before starting, and that is, I think this is the conference I've enjoyed the most about the independence of India and Pakistan, particularly since one I organized way back in 2007 at the University of Southampton. And Pippa Verdi, who's sitting right at the back, was there at that event, and she will recall that there was an extreme weather event at the end of the conference, which involved extensive flooding. And I think it took her about 6 hours to 9 hours. It took her 9 hours to drive about 120 miles from Southampton to Coventry. So I think that's a very good introduction, to the issues of climate change, flooding, and extreme weather, and particularly the issue of deforestation, which I'm going to talk about today. The other thing I want to do is just emphasize a couple of points which I think my presentation links in with what we were discussing yesterday. And two themes which came out, I thought, quite strongly in the various panels was firstly colonial inheritances in terms of institutions and ideas. I'm going to be talking about that in relation to forestry management and some of the contemporary problems that result from that. But also there was a very interesting panel on sort of militancy and armed conflict and the challenges that posed to Pakistan. And one area which, again, I would touch on very briefly, but I think there's a lot of scope really for more research, is the impact of armed conflict on deforestation. There seems to be statistically a very clear correlation between armed conflict of the last 2 or 3 decades and the backwash effects from that and deforestation. So those are 2 areas I want to talk about where I think that this paper links in with what we were saying or hearing about yesterday. A couple of other issues I'm going to discuss in this paper, again, very briefly, is the impact of population pressures on the forests, increasing population in the highland areas of Pakistan. And also, I want to open up, because I think it's important to something I'm really concerned about, and really has prompted people to ask me, well, why are you suddenly doing environmental history? You're just jumping on a bandwagon. All your stuff has been on political history. But the point is that, and in the book, which I've published recently, and certainly in this presentation, I'm trying to get away from the notion that environmental history should be considered in a narrow silo. It can only be understood in a wider political context. And also, I think, by looking at issues around forests and deforestation, we can actually open up other areas relating to governance in Pakistan today, and also the reach of the state. I'm going to finish the paper talking about, again, something which I don't think much work has been done on really, which are the timber mafias and their sort of role in deforestation. So those are the themes really of the presentation. Just to give it a bit of context, because probably not everyone in the room is fully au fait with some of these issues. Some international reports indicate that deforestation in Pakistan is proceeding at 2.1% per annum. That there is some debate about how this is actually counted and whether this is an over or underestimation. If it is at that rate, then certainly you could extrapolate from that within about 50 years, there would be no forest left in Pakistan at all. And even today, the total land area that is covered by forests in Pakistan is only about, according to fairly recent figures, 5%. And this is way below other parts of South Asia. Bhutan, unsurprisingly, leads the way with about 68% of its total land area covered by forest. India, 22.8%. Sri Lanka, around about 30%. Nepal, 25.4%. And even Bangladesh, which has experienced a lot of problems with deforestation and its topography doesn't lend itself anyway to a high rate of forestation, there's 6% of the total land area covered by forest. So you can see that Pakistan is actually in a weak position relative to other areas of South Asia. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters, as we saw very recently in the flooding in 2022, in the monsoon season, that denuding of hill slopes of trees is a major cause of hill torrent flooding, and urban areas even further down, like Tank, were flooded as a result of this sort of long-term deforestation. So it does matter. There's also, of course, the international concerns with people saying that forest tree planting are very important for carbon capture, relating to the impact of human efforts on the economy and global warming as a result of that. So not having forests can affect you locally in terms of extreme weather events, but it can also have longer term implications. This is an opportunity that's missed, perhaps. Having said that, Pakistan obviously in the news not only for the flooding, but also for, as we heard from the ambassador last evening, in terms of the fate that Pakistan suffered, with a third of the country flooded, despite the fact that Pakistan at present is a very low contributor to carbon emissions, did sort of, I think, particularly with the UN General Secretary picking up on this issue, give Pakistan leverage at the recent COP conference. And that could be seen as one of Pakistan's most recent diplomatic successes, as the ambassador said. So Pakistan is very much in the forefront then of these issues of the impact of climate change on a country, and also in terms of the issues around trees and forests. And I'm going to turn to those issues now. And of course, this is a hot issue in Pakistan politics, which is not necessarily a good thing at all. In that the PTI sort of emphasis on tree planting has started in KP using money from the Asian Development Bank, particularly in order to do this tree planting, but also, of course, following the 2018 elections, this became a kind of poster policy for the green agenda of the Imran Khan-led government, but it became a political issue in the sense that people were then questioning, was there corruption? How much is this all hype and rhetoric, and is not actually delivering anything? So it's become a polarizing issue in a very polarized state, but that's another issue not for me to be discussing here, but I'm sure many people in the room are aware of it. So there is this sort of backdrop to that. But I want to get away from all of the political point scoring one way or another. It's too important an issue, actually, to engage in political point scoring, but that's the way politicians operate, you know, not just in Pakistan. So we'll move on from that. And I want to look at these sort of longer term issues, you know, which are around colonial inheritance, particularly, and picking up on some of the things that I think were hinted upon yesterday, which was the post-colonial Pakistan state maintaining some of the policies and outlooks. You could argue, for example, that Orientalist views of local populations as being not conservers of forests, but destroyers of forests is very much a hangover today in Pakistan from these colonial views about local populations and about how they fit in with a sort of scientific, rational, bureaucratic state approach to managing forests. And of course, managing forests means destroying forests in order to modernize. You know, and one could look, for example, at things like the railway development in colonial India and see the impact which that had on deforestation, not just in the Western Himalayas, but also in the Eastern Himalayas. 20,000 miles of track had been laid down by the beginning of the last century, and each mile of track needed a huge amount of timber felling for railway sleepers. So that economic development at the expense of the environment, something which, of course, it's easy in a developed Western country to talk about, it less easy to talk about within a developing country, but nevertheless, there is a payoff here. You do destroy your environment if you want to modernize and have economic development. And that's something which I think people going forward in the next 2 decades really going to have to consider quite sort of seriously in terms of what are their choices, what kind of world do they want to live in the future, how does the environment fit in this, what is our responsibility to future generations. All those are big questions, but I'm not going to sort of reflect on them today. But you can see how this colonial inheritance sort of has an impact on how forests are viewed and how they are managed in terms of harvesting, as it's called, of trees. I think the other colonial inheritance, which is quite important, you know, is the fact that this whole thing about there is a public interest in forests, and this overrides what local populations may want, even if they've had generations of access to the forest. But because, of course, the public interest is in terms of utilizing the forest for these processes of sort of economic growth. And the local people are seen as a result as impediments, not people to work alongside. There have been, from the 1990s, there were some efforts by particularly German and Swiss sort of donors into Pakistan's forestry to try and get a notion of joint management of the forests. Now, you could still see this as management in order to exploit, but nonetheless, joint management was a step forward from this sort of very, as I say, bureaucratic scientific rationale approach. But that's really not worked because local populations are very suspicious of the forestry service. And indeed, there's been a number of surveys of opinions of local populations about the forestry service in Pakistan. And what comes out of these is a surprising remark, perhaps at face value, that it's actually the forestry department, which is the major destroyer of forests in Pakistan. So you can see how this sort of mistrust, this sort of Orientalist hangover view impacts very much on contemporary issues. Of course, local people want access to forests, not just because it is their customary right to graze there or to collect wood for their local consumption. But obviously, leading on to the second point of the paper, population has increased everywhere in Pakistan, including in these highland areas. Now, people need timber for fuel. That's most important because there is no alternative in some of these areas. Well, there is, there's sort of cylinder gas, but that's one, hardly available, and two, increasingly expensive. In fact, even before the current sort of crisis situation relating to this, it was estimated that only 1 in perhaps 5 local families living in highland areas of Pakistan could afford to heat and cook using the gas as opposed to local timber. Then there's obviously a building. One argument would be, well, why do you use pine wood for house building? You know, well, if you don't have access to steel girders, what are you going to build with? You know, so that there's that issue as well. So as populations grow, this is aside from people perhaps wanting to exploit the forest for downstream industry, whether it's paperworks or other sort of aspects of industrial growth. But local populations have these growing demands on the forest. So that leads them into conflict with forest guards, which again is another inheritance of the colonial state. Certainly, the colonial state was employing, in the late colonial era, up to about 8,500 forest guards. And these forest guards were there to repress local populations and to prevent their access to local timber on the basis, as I've said, of this stereotype that these local populations were the cause of the destruction of the forest. And it had nothing to do with the forestry department as such. So you can see how this conflict situation is there in many of these areas. 2 other conflicts or 2 other problems, which I'm going to very briefly, because I can see the time's only on, touch on, and I'm going to read a little bit out of the paper for these, is the issue of armed conflict and how that impacts on deforestation. And then finally, to say something about the timber mafia, which is, of course, one of the numerous mafias in Pakistan. The land mafia is the one that's written about the most and is known about because it's in an urban context. There's much less written about the timber mafia as such. So then, armed conflict and deforestation. Let's go beyond Pakistan and look at other parts of the world for a minute and then go back to Pakistan. Evidence from Rwanda and Madagascar point to armed conflict playing a major role in deforestation. There's a number of reports being brought out about this. And I'll give you the references if you want later, but I've got them here in the paper. So armed conflict, why does it lead to deforestation? Well, obviously, if there's actual military operation, then it's going to happen. Often, of course, counterinsurgency involves clearing forests because there's all these terrorists there. So you clear the forest, and that is a factor in deforestation. So turning to Pakistan, and in particular Western Himalayas, 1980s Afghan crisis has been linked to 45% loss of forest cover in the Siran Valley in the Mansehra district between 1979 and 1988. Why is that? Well, this wasn't because of armed conflict, but the blowback from it. The refugees from Afghanistan who were settling there and wanted their own heating, cooking, construction. Generation later, from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, fallout from 9/11, war on terror, in inverted commas, impacted on the natural environment. Satellite data has revealed that in Waziristan, a region badly impacted by militancy post 9/11, this is the area that's experienced the greatest loss of tree cover in the period 2000 to 2010. Probably well over 30,000 hectares have gone as a result of this. And of course, the coverage there altogether not just in this area, in the Western Himalayas in that period, was about 95,000 hectares. So we're talking about significant impacts here. And the figures, I think, support the idea, not just of counterinsurgency action here, but also militant exploitation of timber. Just as, of course, there was exploitation in other areas, you know, in the marble trade in East Afghanistan, for example, and in parts of Fatah. Because exploitation of raw materials is one means of getting funds, and militant groups engaged in action need funding. Where do they get their funding from? So that's one area. I've just touched on a few very highlight points, but I think that a scholar is required to really look into these issues of militancy and its impact. I've not come across much about it. Right, very quickly at the end, what is the timber mafia? Well, the timber mafia came, I suppose, into prominence when there was an official ban on timber harvesting in 1992. After extensive floods in this part of Pakistan arising really from deforestation. This pushed up the price of timber in Pakistan, so it was double the world price. So immediately you can see that there's an economic incentive at play here. The ban was lifted in 2002-03, but then reintroduced. Like land mafias in Pakistan cities, there was a nexus of what I would call corrupt politicians, bureaucrats, and criminal operators involved in the timber mafia. And it's all about, I suppose, bigger issues, criminalization of politics, politicization of bureaucracy in Pakistan. And I think that I'll just give you sort of some examples of this and how it operates, and then I'll finish on that point. So large-scale illegal felling of timber and its smuggling requires logistical resources and political cover. Political cover is very important here. It's not a case of someone going along and felling a few trees and then selling them in a local market. We're talking about large-scale, certainly trans-Pakistan and transnational illegal trade in timber. Timber mafias operate, and they still do to an extent, smuggling timber into Afghanistan. Some of the latter timber could then be re-imported as legal, in inverted commas, into Pakistan and resold at a profit. Because, of course, there are higher prices in Pakistan than in Afghanistan. So you can see how this operates. So these large-scale mafia activities, of course, cause environmental degradation. They lead to conflicts sometimes with the forestry guards, but also with local populations. But unfortunately, sometimes the forestry management are in on this game and take their cut from this. There's four common themes which I found emerged in press reporting. And it's local press reporting, particularly Urdu dailies such as Mashriq, published from Peshawar, Aj from Peshawar, and Abbottabad, and Azadi, published in Swat. These local press reports really have four themes. I'm going to finish on these four themes relating to the activities of the timber mafia. Firstly, the extent of the activities. I've already hinted at these. These aren't local guys who are just sort of cutting down a few trees and that's it. Use of force to intimidate local low-level forest staff. The use of political influence. What do I mean by that? To secure transfers of staff who resist timber smuggling. We all know about how staff are moved around, police staff and other sort of groups in Pakistan in order to serve political interests. ARJ on the 24th of May 2004 produced a lengthy report on the fact that trucks were transporting hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of illegally cut timber 24 hours a day. And this huge timber smuggling activity was facilitated by members of the forestry staff. And when there was an attempt to control this, they were prevented from doing so. Arch later editorialized the timber mafia had made billions by destroying the national wealth of the forests. Dawn echoed the seriousness of the issue, declaring the reckless felling of trees had seriously endangered 20 species. It called for curbs on the timber mafia. This was a decade before Imran Khan started speaking publicly about the issue of the timber mafia. And I just mentioned one more. Mashriq reported the murder of a forest officer in Boona district. His colleagues organized a protest meeting, which called for the immediate arrest of the culprits. Later, the president of the Forest Officers Association called for the arming of his members with modern weapons, because, of course, the timber mafia could easily outgun forest guards. But I think that the difference is the political influence that they can bring to bear, and that's really the important consideration. So this extract perfectly illustrates the point, and I'm finishing on this point. And I'm going to read the extract into translation. During a visit to the Pir Baba Khalil Swat Road Forest, a team of journalists noted the illegal felling of trees in the Boona Valley. And the smuggling of timber was going on unchecked due to the involvement of officials of the Forest Department in corrupt practices. They also noted that an open timber market was being run at Sangar. Referring to an open forum, the report said that whenever Forest Department officials visited the area, instead of taking any action against the timber mafia, they indulged in, quote, receiving illegal gratification from the smugglers, or even if they did seize the timber, so they were taking some action, they sold it to make money. So the forest, the report finishes, was resembling a timber market as a result of the large number of cut down trees. And it seemed that the Forest Department was non-existent in this district. Right, I'm going to finish there. I'm just going to finish with a plea. I hope that a younger generation of scholars will pick up on some of these issues which I've raised, because they are really important issues to be addressed. But I do think, and it reiterates the point I made right at the outset, that this has got to be done, not in terms of a mere silo of environmental history. It's got to be set within a wider political framework of understanding how things operate at the grassroots level in Pakistan. And I'm looking forward to seeing, before I get too old, some of these new studies emerging on this. So thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Talbot, for this. And I think, yeah, this is a very, it's like so many of the facts that you gave were just eye-opening. Like in 50 years, Pakistan might not have any forests. And I think that, and the whole timber mafia and how deep it is. And, it kind of reminds me that about 50 years ago, being a forest officer, and in fact, of course, there was the Indian Forest Service,
yes,
was a big deal. And then since independence, that's kind of gone down, and now we know the results of it. But any questions, comments? We have just a couple of minutes for that. Yes.
Sorry, I must admit, I was having my morning coffee as you were talking. So perhaps I missed a stat, but I don't know if the stat exists. I know that the British geographical surveys of the late early 1900s mapped forests.
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, in one of them, something like 60% of the region was thought to be under tree cover, whether it was light woodland or or dense forest. Do we know in what became Pakistan what the percentage was?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I could find out for you, but I don't know the exact figures in terms of what
4%.
4%.
It was in 1960, 4%.
Mm.
And I was reading some new government report. It's still 4%.
Mm.
So nobody's actually surveyed anything.
No.
Oh, wow.
I mean, these figures are always estimates of what happens. I mean, I did make the point that there is a debate about the actual rate of depletion of forest in Pakistan, and depending on what means you use, in terms of how you do the survey, is it satellite imaging or are there other means? You come up with different figures. So 2.1% is possibly the high figure. It might be less than that, but no doubt, that there is forest depletion going on.
Can I ask a question? It's very depressing, and sadly I know all about it. The solution, is there one? Then I will propose something.
Right. Yes. I mean, I think that the issue has been around, for quite some time, knowing that this is a problem. But how do you deal with this? In terms of the fact that there are not just local issues. This is within a wider context of the way in which politics operate. Why should local politicians, be protecting timber mafia? Well, why are local politicians in parts of Sindh protecting dacoits? Which is an issue at the moment there. So it's within this sort of frame, I think. That you need to put it in issues of governance. But so many of the reports which are produced really only look at it purely in terms of this local study, of a forest and what's happened to it, rather than taking it into the bigger picture, and saying, well, okay, I can see why that's happening there, but what does this say more generally, and what could be done at a more general level, relating to this, rather than just a local response.
We'll just collect all the comments and then perhaps we can just respond to them.
The solution.
Sure.
I mean, it's a solution which the West won't like. And I think the solution is, religion. How so? If you sort of convince that they are worshipful beings, trees, because all these facts don't matter anymore because there's too much money in it. And the other thing is you start at the bottom level, education. If you get school children involved in it and they start honoring trees and respecting trees and what it means, probably that's a solution. Something, on a less religious theme, it could be what Khalil Gibran said, trees are poems that the earth writes upon the sky. If you can sort of make it touch you here, then maybe it will work. I've thought about it a lot. And there's too much corruption, there's too much money. You can't solve it any other way other than education at the lowest level.
Yeah, well, obviously one response which is often made, is to say, well, okay, we've got to try and link conservation with employment opportunities, for locals, so that they won't be tempted, to either cut down trees themselves on a small scale. They're not the main source of the problem. But nonetheless, to give them an incentive to feel that they have a role to play in the protection of the local environment. You could do that through economic incentives. You could perhaps do it, through cultural, religious incentives.
Actually, that's, sorry, I keep butting in, but they did that with the Markhor. It was very successful. What they did was they earmarked certain areas and they would have these heavy you could come and shoot them, but for a very high price, like $50,000, $100,000, and 80% of the money would go to the local community. So there was a great incentive to secure, but at the same time you could. So maybe if you sort of give a certain percentage to the local people about the trees, then they'll safeguard them because it's a valuable resource for them. So that's worked in the case of the Markhor, which would have been wiped out. But for this sort of conservation, incentivized conservation.
We'll just quickly grab it.
Just one very quick observation. What you were talking about, that the local population needs the trees for fuel, for heating and all that. So if anybody does any research on it, there's a lot to be done in terms of If you go up north, you'll see a lot of women doing this. And they go out of their homes, and I don't see how any research being doing in terms of agency. And
Can you just grab point, John? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Barbara Harris-White at Oxford has actually led a huge effort, not just her own work, but her students across South Asia, including I think one or two people working in Pakistan, who look at this from a development perspective, connecting the political to the environmental, right, the entire political economy of this. And I think what a really important sort of an unexpected, it's the law of unintended consequences, is really, there's a massive argument for campaign finance reform in South Asia. Fundamentally, these revenues pay for political party machinery, right? And there's fundamentally a lack of legal ways to raise finances. So instead, the incentives are for politicians to profit off illegal trades. And so when you link up all of these different solutions, campaign finance reform, community-based profit from natural resources, emotional and spiritual sort of and cultural investment, then you start to see the shape of a sustained solution.
Last comments, yeah.
Yeah, last comments, no pressure. Thanks so much. I've done lots of work on the environmental history of forests in other parts of South Asia for a long time, so it's lovely to hear you bring it up. A suggestion maybe, or I think there's been a shift maybe in the last 20 years away from just talking about the histories of forestry to talking about agrarian environments and tracing those kind of frontier shifts in different parts. So for example, in Bengal, Sugata Bose and K. Shiva Ramakrishnan, lots of work talking about how if we look at the different roles of the colonial infrastructure and other things like malaria and other things, forests tended to come and go. And so it's sort of, I guess, establishing a dynamic relationship with other bigger processes that you're suggesting around land, around political structures, etc. And then obviously also there's that big gender issue and the way that the Ford Foundation and all those kind of institutions in the 1980s started to try and bring in participatory forest management in different parts of Nepal and India and Pakistan, etc. There's lots of stuff about the gendered relations within the household, about different valuations of forests and what that means in terms of management solutions. So it's such a great, I'm so glad that you're doing this study. It's such a great field.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.